Well, good morning and welcome to today's webinar, introducing the new legislation and pathway recognising products certified overseas. We should all be aware of the government's goal to reduce the cost of construction. Well, imported products are not new to us. In fact, over 70% of building materials used in New Zealand today are sourced from overseas. And at the heart of this new legislation is a move to further increase competition and reduce barriers. In particular, the requirement and cost of local certification for quality building materials already certified overseas. So the objective of today's session is to provide you with an overview of, firstly, how the approved products certified overseas pathway will work, what is behind this pathway to reassure you of the mechanics and process that's been developed by MB, and information on the next steps, and in particular, the timing, the next 3 phases of the rollout, which go into 2026. My name is Matthew Duder. I'm General Manager of EBOS. We've spent the last 19 years working with product suppliers to format their technical documentation, and we manage the BPIR-ready software. Today, I'm coordinating this webinar with a team of MB managers and principal advisors, who I'll introduce shortly. We also are joined by Byron, Alan, Claire, and Evan from MB, who will be assisting with your questions and comments. Now, this session today is exclusive for builders and plumbers. We have a concise 25-minute presentation and have allowed another 25 minutes for your questions. A recording of this webinar will be published on the Building Performance website over the next week, if you want to re-watch this, or if you've got colleagues who have missed out. And we do appreciate your feedback. So we will be running polls at the beginning and the end of today's session. In fact, let's kick off with an intro poll to understand your level of existing knowledge of this new pathway. So I appreciate you spending a few moments just to complete that before we begin. Now, throughout the presentation, we welcome your questions. So if you can use the Q&A function, which you can find in your menu at the bottom of the screen, our team will look to address those either during the session online or as part of the Q&A session that follows. So to kick things off, I'd like to welcome Sophie Cunningham, Manager of Building Regulatory Services. Sophie, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks, Matt. And kia ora koutou, everybody. As those who have kept up to date with announcements will know, this pathway is one of 3 that has been introduced to provide New Zealanders with more choice of building products and healthier, safer and more durable buildings while balancing costs. We've already completed a number of webinars on the first 2 pathways, those being the building product specifications, the first version of which was published in July this year, and the endorsed standards pathway. For those who want more general information on these 2 pathways, there is a recording of the webinar from June that's available on our website, which includes more high-level detail. The focus of today's webinar, however, will be around the recognition of building products certified overseas. So today we will provide relevant details specifically for plumbers and builders, highlighting some key areas where we're seeing questions come from. I'll provide a brief overview of the specific pathway now to begin, and then I'll follow with a little bit more detail later on in the webinar. So at a high level, this pathway will see MB evaluating building products and building methods certified under an overseas product certification scheme and issuing a recognition notice. These recognition notices will have the same status as product certificates under the Building Act and must be accepted by a building consent authority if the product is being used within its conditions and limitations. They will detail what New Zealand Building Code clauses and standards the products have been assessed against and if there are any conditions or limitations on the product's use. So in terms of where we're at in our process, you can see we've had a pretty busy 2025 so far. The legislation that enables this pathway was introduced in April this year, closely followed by the commencement of the relevant regulations. The building product certification regulations are now updated with relevant information for this pathway. For For ease of explanation, we've broken down the implementation into 3 phases. Phase 1 and 2 relate to watermark product certificates. The Minister selected watermark as the first scheme that will have product certificates evaluated for recognition. Watermark is referenced in New Zealand Building Code compliance documents for plumbing and drainage products, and many of the products and their materials are widely accepted and tested against joint Australia and New Zealand standards. Phase 1 is complete and saw 22 recognition notices published on the 22nd of September, covering about 92,000 products for tapware and other products. These recognition notices and relevant information can be found on our Building Performance website. The recognition notices issued under Phase 1 include watermark product certificates that are certified to joint Australia and New Zealand standards and the Australian standard for tapware AS3718. It's important to note that not all products under these standards that have a watermark certificate are included in these notices. For example, a certificate that expires before 2026 is not included. We're currently in the early days of Phase 2, and this phase will see the next lot of watermark certificates be recognised, which will include those certified to Australian standards or watermark technical specifications. This will likely be completed by the end of this year. Phase 3 will be a starting point for other recognitions outside of watermark. We're developing an application process for recognition of other non-watermark products, and when released in mid-2026, product manufacturers, suppliers, and importers of all building products or methods with an overseas certification can apply directly to MB for recognition. More on this later in the webinar. As you may have heard in previous webinars, the process for recognising product certificates involves 2 key steps. The first is an assessment of the product certification scheme against the criteria set out in the regulations previously mentioned. The second step is an evaluation of the product certificate itself. So today we want to take a closer look at certification schemes, as we've noticed there's still some confusion around what they are and how they work. So what is a product certification scheme? A product certification scheme is a formal process that verifies whether a product consistently meets specific standards or regulatory requirements. It gives assurance to regulators, industry professionals, and consumers that the product has been properly evaluated and is safe, reliable, and fit for purpose. You'll see the key elements of a typical scheme on the screen now. Let's start with the accreditation body. This is usually a nominated organisation responsible for accrediting other organisations, commonly referred to as conformity assessment bodies, or CABs for short. For simplicity, I'll stick with CABs throughout. For this pathway, the accreditation body must belong to an internationally recognised organisation, such as the International Accreditation Forum. And they must accredit CABs to an appropriate standard. You can think of this as a cascading set of requirements designed to ensure that every party involved is doing what they've committed to. Next in the chain is the CABs themselves. These are independent, third-party organisations that assess products. They evaluate the evidence provided to determine whether the product complies with the relevant standards for its intended use. It's important to note that CABs don't usually test the product directly. Instead, they evaluate test results. Sometimes they may request additional testing during the evaluation process, and this might be carried out by another part of the same organisation. This distinction is often misunderstood, especially when organisations operate under a single brand but have multiple functions. Take Brands as an example. Brands both has a testing arm and an appraisal and code mark service. One of the key requirements of a certification scheme is that the conflicts of interest and impartiality are managed, so the evaluation remains independent. Certification schemes often work alongside local legislation and standards like ISO 17065, which ensures that CABs have robust policies, procedures, and systems in place, and that these are properly implemented. Another important point is that certification isn't a one-off event. Certified products are monitored on an ongoing basis to ensure they continue to meet requirements. This might involve manufacturer audits or checks to confirm that the installation methods and the technical documentation are still current and correct. Now you might be wondering, if a building product is already certified by a trusted overseas third party, why does it need to be recertified or appraised locally? This question goes to the heart of this new legislation. The intent is that MB will be able to evaluate both the overseas certification scheme and the product certificate and then issue a recognition notice. This notice confirms that the product's performance, as stated in the overseas product certificate, meets the minimum requirements of the New Zealand Building Code. To begin with, we've focused on one particular scheme, the watermark scheme, as this has allowed us to test the process and simplify implementation for industry. In future, this approach will be expanded to cover all product categories. So how does this work in practice? There are product certification schemes operating all over the world. These schemes evaluate and certify products based on their own rules and standards. Once a product meets those requirements, a product certificate is issued by the CAB, that's the conformity assessment body, and the ongoing monitoring begins. When someone applies for a product evaluation through the new overseas products certification pathway, MB checks several key criteria. Is the certification scheme accredited to an appropriate standard by a recognised accreditation body? Does the scheme have robust processes in place? And importantly, do those processes cover how the scheme evaluates, certifies, and monitors products or methods? We also look at whether the scheme ensures its staff and certifiers act independently, professionally, and with integrity. These checks are essential to ensure that the overseas certification scheme is trustworthy and that the product certificate can be relied on to meet New Zealand Building Code requirements. So after that, let's talk about the output of this process. This is what we call a recognition notice. As mentioned earlier, to issue a recognition notice, MB must complete a two-step process: evaluation of the product certification scheme and the evaluation of the product certificate issued under that scheme. Once we're confident that the certification scheme meets the criteria set out in the regulations, the next step is to evaluate the product certificate itself. To do this, we look at whether the certificate is accessible. For example, can it be readily accessed by the public? And that it contains enough technical detail to enable us to provide a translation of the certified product's intended use. It's compliant with the relevant clauses of the building code and any conditions and limitations that may be needed to be put on as part of that recognition. We'll also check for any bans or warnings on the product and confirm that the certifier's accreditation hasn't been suspended or revoked. Most importantly, we need solid evidence that the product or method will comply with the New Zealand Building Code when used as intended. Because this is a technical process, MB may engage external experts to support robust and informed decision making. If the certificate meets all the criteria set out in the regulations, we'll begin the process of formally drafting the recognition notice. Now, it's important to understand that a recognition notice is a form of secondary legislation, just like an acceptable solution or a verification method. That means we include product certificate numbers or standards in the notice. It's considered incorporation by reference. As a result, we're required to carry out a public consultation. This gives the sector and the wider public a chance to provide feedback on whether the information in the notice is suitable for recognition. We did this once in early September for the products included in phase 1, as mentioned before. Once consultation closes and we've reviewed all the submissions, MB has a number of options. We can either finalise the notice as proposed in the consultation documents, amend the notice to reflect the feedback we've got from submissions, or in some cases decide not to proceed with the recognition notice at all. If the decision is to proceed, however, the Minister of Building and Construction is required to table the notice in Parliament and once tabled, that notice is officially confirmed. MB will publish the notice in the New Zealand Gazette and on our register available on the Building Performance website. Just like other forms of secondary legislation, recognition notices can be amended or revoked. For example, if the product certificate changes or becomes invalid. So I'll now pass on to Amanda McCauley, our Principal Advisor in our System Performance and Implementation team. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Soph, and kia ora everyone. Thanks for joining us. So, as a recognition notice is a deemed to comply pathway, a building consent authority must accept a notice as evidence of compliance with the building code, provided the product has been specified in accordance with its intended use and every limitation and condition stated in the recognition notice is complied with. So in practice, recognition notices will have the same weight as a New Zealand Code Mark certificate or a national multi-use approval, or as most people call it, a multi-proof approval. So I'll take an example from one of our recently published Phase 1 watermark recognition notices that you can see. Now, to use a recognition notice for a watermark product, you must first find the product certificate details on the Australian Building Code Board register or the Conformity Assessment Body register to ensure the certificate is valid. You can see on this product certificate here on the screen that the CAB here is SAO Global, and you'll be able to find the CAB details on any watermark certificate. Now, if you want to use the certificate as a deemed to comply pathway, you must then also ensure that the recognition notice has the certificate listed on it, including the appropriate version. And as Sophie mentioned before, you can find all our published recognition notices on our Building Performance website at www.building.govt.nz. So on the screen at the moment, you can see an example of one of our watermark recognition notices. Now, as you can see, the recognition notice clearly states the building code clauses that the evaluation process has verified that the product complies with. The notice also outlines the scope and intended use of the product, as well as any relevant conditions and limitations. And you can see here on this notice that it has additional conditions to ensure the product complies with our building code and our New Zealand environment. Now, it also notes all the product certificates that this notice covers. In the case of watermark certificates, the recognition also notes the standard to which the product certificate relates to, and this is a particular feature of the watermark scheme. Now, an easy way to find out if a watermark certificate is included on a notice is to check which standard it has been evaluated against and then find the recognition notice for that standard. If the certificate is not listed on the notice or it has changed or expired, then it's not able to be used as part of the deemed to comply pathway. Now, if using the deemed to comply pathway for a product, you must first verify that the product is installed correctly according to the approved plans and specifications and ensure it can be used as intended to meet the performance requirements of the building code. Now, MB's recognition process may have determined that certain limitations may apply to using this product, so it's important to ensure that you check that these, if the product is being used under this pathway. It's also important to note that code clauses specified on a recognition notice are just those that we've been able to validate through the recognition notice, or through the recognition process, sorry. Now, there may be other relevant code clauses that are relevant to this product or its intended use that will also need to be considered when specifying the product. Now, in terms of using a recognised product in a consent application, what you'll need to do is have a copy of the watermark certificate and a copy of the recognition notice, and you're also confident that the certificate is listed on the notice, and you'll provide both of these with your building consent application. Now, the Building Consent Authority will then do their due diligence and check that the recognition notice is current and includes the noted certificate. They'll check that the certificate itself is current and that the product is being used in accordance with its intended use and within the relevant conditions and limitations that may be specified on the recognition. Now, if any of these fail in the check, then the watermark certificate cannot be used as a deemed to comply pathway, and the Building Consent Authority will need to continue assessing the product following their usual reasonable grounds assessment. For Phase 3, we will have a modified process, and we will outline this in a webinar in the new year. I think it's important to note too that we are currently in the process of training building consent authorities on this pathway, particularly their roles and responsibilities when it comes to processing building consent applications that are accompanied by recognition notices to ensure this is a streamlined and painless process. So another aspect of installing recognised products is where do minor variations and product substitutions fit? Now, the amendment regulations in 2024 codified 3 new principles in law. One that, in particular, a minor variation must not deviate significantly from the original plans, and product substitution is allowed if it achieves an equivalent or better level of performance and it does not compromise compliance of other building work. Now, we have guidance on our website for this. And another note is that a building consent authority has the discretion to determine whether a change is minor or does require a formal amendment. Now, in terms of liability, a builder's liability for using a recognised overseas product depends on whether the product was installed correctly and according to the conditions and limitations of its recognition. Now, this means using the product according to the intended use of the product and those conditions and limitations specified on the recognition notice. You'll need to ensure that installation is consistent with the product certificate's details or relevant technical information, and also verify that the product itself is materially the same specified in the recognition notice. And as you all know, the implied warranty section of the Building Act requires that materials must be suitable for their intended use and will be fit for purpose, and that all building work will be done properly, competently, and according to the plans and specifications in the approved consent. Building work also needs to be consistent with the Building Act and the Building Code. So in practice, this means being familiar with the product and its intended use and any conditions specified in the notice. And you can see this in the same way that you would use a code-marked product. So monitoring and enforcement. Now, as Sophie mentioned earlier, recognition notices are secondary legislation and they don't have expiry dates. So for this, that means MB needs to have a monitoring framework in place to ensure that all recognised products continue to comply with the building code. So for example, we will be regularly checking if any product certificates have changed or expired, and if new product certificates have been added to a scheme we've evaluated. Now, if a product certificate has changed, we will need to assess that it still meets all the criteria for recognition, and if required, a recognition notice can be amended or revoked. Now, reliance on a recognition notice or associated product certificate that has since been amended or suspended after issuing a building consent will not affect the validity of that consent as it was valid at the time the consent was issued. A monitoring framework means that we will proactively monitor and communicate with schemes when certificates are getting close to expiry. And for any expired or withdrawn certificates, we would look to amend the relevant recognition notice and communicate these changes to building consent authorities as we do for suspended or withdrawn code-marked certificates. Now, if you do note anything in a recognition notice that you believe should be amended, then please email us at our overseas products inbox that we'll post in the chat in this webinar. Now, as we mentioned in the timeline earlier, MB is currently in the process of recognising the remaining watermark certificates, and we aim to have this work completed by Christmas. Now, looking ahead, Phase 3 will mark the beginning of recognising overseas certified products beyond watermark, and this could potentially include products like cladding, insulation, and windows. The details of the application process for Phase 3 are still being developed. We're taking on board the lessons that we've learned from our watermark recognition process so far to help shape a smooth experience for applicants and industry. Don't worry, we'll be providing clear guidance well before applications open. And this will include things like what information MB would need to see in an application and how the application process will work. And we will provide further information on this phase later in this year or early next year. Another focus for us in Phase 2 and 3 is education. Now, EBOS and MB have already planned and completed a number of sessions with industry to further inform them of these changes and what it may mean for them. We've run sessions for product suppliers and importers, an introductory session for building consent authorities, and yesterday we did a session for architects and specifiers. And as we've already noted, We have a part 2 of a specialised training session for building consent authorities on the 22nd of October to educate them on the process and their roles and responsibilities when processing a consent using a recognition notice. So that's it from me, and I'll now pass back to Matt for question time.
Thanks very much, Amanda. So in summary, the Overseas Building Products Certification pathway is live with a focus on tapware and other like products. This will expand to more complex watermarked products in December, and then in mid-2026, there will be an application process set up for all other building product categories like cladding, windows, and insulation. So in mid-2026, product suppliers should be considering this as a compliance pathway for either existing or new products that have overseas certification. So this is something that you should start seeing in late 2026 when these first non-watermark recognition notices should start appearing. All right, as I mentioned, we've got a few minutes for your questions. You can use the Q&A function, and we'll get into a few of those now. Thanks, Amanda and Sophie, for coming back and joining me here. Sophie, I'll come to you first. Just can you clarify why we did select the watermark scheme first for recognition notices?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt. So watermark was selected first as Australia, which has a similar regulatory environment to New Zealand, mandates watermark certification for specific plumbing and drainage products, which I think probably everybody in the audience knows. And many watermark certificates are also widely accepted. It kind of gave us and MB a bit of time to take a measured approach to implementing this new legislation and this new pathway.
Sophie, another question for you. There could be some recognition notices that don't reference all code requirements for a product. Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. And a really good question and quite an important distinction to make, I think. So for those who are familiar with a code mark certificate, you'll know that those that have a code mark have to have certified products need to have all relevant building code clauses to its intended use included on that certificate. Recognition notices, however, is different. And as Amanda mentioned earlier, they're slightly different in regard to some of the limitations that we can put on code clauses for recognition notice. So recognition notices are scheme specific, meaning obviously as touched on before, we have to evaluate and recognise the scheme first before the product certificate can be considered. The scope of a recognition notice is quite tightly defined, and the notice will specify the product's intended use and relevant building code clauses and conditions and limitations, which you would have seen on the example. But the code clauses that we can note the product are complying with will be dependent on the information on the certificate that we can evaluate and validate. So there may be some code clauses that sit outside of the ones that are on that recognition notice that may need to be considered for particular cases.
Great, thank you. Amanda, I'm going to cut to you next. Do the recognition notices contain any information about the applicant, the New Zealand supplier and importer? So will we know who has actually made the application and received the notice?
Thanks, Matt. In short, no. So the recognition notices, they cover the technical information. So it'll be the product certificates themselves. And as mentioned earlier, part of this process is making sure they're publicly accessible. So that's all public information. In terms of the watermark recognition notices, we've also listed the standards to which those products have been evaluated and certified against, and also the link to the AS/NZS 3500 series, which is how we established the link to building code compliance here. So we won't be publishing any additional information about the applicant or the supplier or importer in these notices. Okay,
Amanda, I'll stick with you. The initial consultation period for phase 1 seemed short. So can you just elaborate how long the consultation period will be for the further phases?
Yeah, good question. So we're required to provide a reasonable time for people to provide feedback when we hold public consultations. Now, the consultation for phase 1 of the Watermark products was short. However, Standards Australia were great and came to the party for that one, and they provided us very generously with free read-only access to those CITA standards for that short duration. Subsequent consultation periods will be longer. We usually aim for at least 10 working days or 2 weeks when we do public consultations, and this is the process that we will follow for subsequent ones. We're unlikely, to be fair, to get free access to international standards for these consultations, so we will make sure that those consultation periods are longer. I will note, however, that for the phase 2 of the Watermark products, Watermark technical specifications are able to be accessed by the public, so they'll be able to be referenced as part of this consultation. And we're aiming to open consultation for this phase 2 at the end of this month, and that will run through to the middle of November.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Sophie, I want to go to you now. Mentioned in the presentation that MB may bring on people to assist with the evaluation of certificates in different product categories. A few questions. How will these technical experts be selected?
Yeah, sure. Good question. So selecting technical experts is a really important part of the recognition process, and the technical experts that we use for particular recognitions may differ depending on the product category or the scheme that we're evaluating at the time for the recognition. That being said, all technical experts will be required to be very familiar with the New Zealand Building Code and assessing relevant standards to New Zealand conditions. So when selecting TEs, we'll look at their relevant experience, likely in line with the product type or the scheme that we're looking at as a whole.
Thanks, Sophie. Obviously, these products are coming or certified overseas. How do you evaluate those products to ensure they're suitable for, firstly, the New Zealand Building Code, but also our specific climate?
Yeah, another good question. So I think the answer to the TE question is also relevant to this question as well. So part of ensuring that it's suitable for New Zealand Building Code and New Zealand climate is having really good technical expertise to help us in that assessment. I think it's important to note that if we can't find a link, we won't put it on a recognition notice, or if it doesn't meet the kind of have a pretty solid evaluation, it won't be issued with a recognition notice. If we can't find a particular link to a code clause, we won't put that code clause on the certificate. So that's not to say that it won't comply with that code clause. It's just for the purposes of the recognition process, it won't be included within that notice as a deemed to comply pathway. Okay.
Amanda, question, won't this just slow down council processing time and create more work?
Well, the intent is the complete opposite of that. We might not have mentioned earlier, but when we said that a building consent authority must accept a recognition notice as evidence of compliance, this has been added to the Building Act under Section 19. So a recognition notice has the same legal status as a code mark certificate, a multi-proof approval, acceptable solutions and verification methods. So a big key of making sure that this process runs smoothly is this education we mentioned earlier. We've already had one introductory session with building consent authorities and another one next week to really get into the process of how they should be looking at recognition notices that have been included in a consent application and making sure that they're fulfilling their roles and responsibilities in the same way that they would process a multi-proof and acceptable solution verification method or a code mark certificate. So the intent is that it will be streamlined like those pathways.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Sophie, we've got a question here. Just to be clear, non-recognition notice products can still be used if they comply with the building code requirements and have certification/test results to verify their suitability.
Yeah, sure. So I did flag that I wanted to kind of chat to that live, although it's not a question, it's a very kind of important statement to reiterate. That's true. Yes. So just because a product may not have a recognition notice, it does not mean that it will not comply with the building code. So you would follow exactly the same process you follow now in order to verify compliance, whether that be at kind of building consent application stage or through installation and inspections and all that sort of stuff. So the process that existed before still exists. This is just an additional pathway.
Right. Thank you. Amanda, lots of questions around liability. Will a BCA be liable at all for relying on a recognition notice?
Yeah, good question. So a building consent authority has liability protection for anything done or omitted to be done in good faith regarding a recognition notice, which is the same liability setting as for a code mark product. So they are required to accept a recognition notice as evidence of compliance with the building code. And they need to ensure that the recognition notice and product certificate are both valid and that product is being used as intended and according to any conditions or limitations in the recognition notice. But that's essentially the extent of their role.
Okay, let's stick with liability and talk about MB. So would MB be liable for failure of a product that relied on a recognition notice?
So MB also has liability protection, but I think it's important to consider the circumstances of a product failure. So the liability settings remain exactly as they are right now for any imported product. So suppliers and importers need to ensure that the products they supply comply with the relevant provisions of the building code if they're installed in accordance with the technical data, specifications, etc., prescribed by the manufacturer. So in short, liability settings aren't changing. They're the same as they are now for any imported product.
Byron, you're there in the background. I just wonder if we can bring you up. I think you'd be the best person to answer a couple of questions here. Firstly, with the shift to lead-free coming in May 2026, has lead-free been considered for recognition of overseas products or overseas certifications?
Yep.
So, yeah.
So kind of, Sophie kind of touched on it already with the recognition notices, but any standard that calls for products that have lead in it that don't comply with 0.25% won't be recognised in our notices, but it doesn't mean that you can't use it up until the date if it meets all the other building requirements. That's definitely been considered in our recognition process.
Great. Byron, I hope this question means something to you. Will MB recognise bidet douche products under watermark?
So currently, bidet douche tend to have internal backflow prevention. That's currently not permitted under our building code. So that's something that we'll be investigating and looking into quite closely if we do recognise it.
Okay, Byron, thank you. Amanda, I'm going to come back to you. What if a product is not part of an overseas scheme, but has been tested to overseas standards?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know we've had many questions around products that have been tested to standards. So this is one of 3 pathways that were introduced by the Amendment Act this year. So there are 2 potential other pathways that could be used if your product has been tested or manufactured to an overseas standard. Now, one is the Minister's endorsed standards, and this is a guidance level pathway. So the Minister has endorsed groups of building and construction related standards that have been issued by, at the moment, 11 overseas standards organisations. And this is a good rule of thumb for building consent authorities. They can have regard to standards that have been issued by these endorsed standards. Another quite relevant pathway is the building product specifications. And the first edition, I think Sophie mentioned earlier, was published in July this year. And so what the creation of the building product specifications has done is taken, at the moment, there's 130 standards that have been pulled from acceptable solutions of verification methods and put into a separate document. So the way the intent of this is that as we go through more evaluation work within MB, we'll add more and more international standards that meet or exceed our requirements, which provides more options for using acceptable solution verification method pathways. So if you've got a product that's been tested or manufactured according to an overseas standard that you think is compliant, I'd encourage you to give your feedback to us. You can go to our inbox at building@govt.nz, and the building performance engineering team who do a lot of this technical work can have a look and see if these overseas standards could potentially be added to further versions of the building product specifications. So that is also another really good pathway for products tested to standards.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. I'll just pause for a second before we get into our final questions. We've just got a few minutes left. Firstly, Nancy, are you able to put a link or put the email address for anyone who is looking to contact MB directly? There's a specific email, so we'll put that into the chat line now. And secondly, for those of you who do have to shoot off, we're just going to put up a final poll. Like to get your feedback on the clarity of the information today, whether you've still got further questions around the application of this new legislation, and whether or not you're interested at all in using this as a compliance pathway in the future. So do appreciate your feedback if you do have to take off before we conclude today. All right, a final few questions here. Firstly, from Oliver. Good morning from Germany, Oliver. I assume it's evening your time. Does this mean that also the AS 6400 Wells Australia has come in place now for taps and showers? Oliver then also has a follow-up question. How will this be for combined products, i.e. shower pipes, where there's a shower and a thermostatic mixer combined? Both underlie watermark in Australia, but also have watermark for the thermostatic mixer, or will that be part of a new system? Amanda, Sophie, or Byron, can I get your comments on Oliver's questions there?
Might pass to Byron for that one, if that's okay. Byron, if you're all good.
Yeah, so thanks, Oliver, for your question. So in terms of the acceptance of the compliance system, so we are recognising it by the standard themselves. So if the standard and the product are under their certificate, then that's how we'll be selecting those in terms of AS 640. That'll be part of the assessment, and then we'll verify that against the existing standards that we have in place if it meets the performance requirements of the building code. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Byron. Look, a question that we received, which Claire's actually answered online, but I just thought it'd be worthwhile for the team here. Will watermark certified products that have expired be monitored in an immediate sense? Or these expired products only get picked up if they're audited and reviewed by chance?
Good question. So, so Claire's kind of noted in the response there that we'll be monitoring them by expiry date. We kind of hold a bit of a chunky list of all the product certificates for watermark and their expiry date. So we'll have a monitoring schedule that will go through and make sure that we flag if that certificate has been included on a recognition notice and it is either expired or coming up to expiry. We'll make sure we take appropriate action for that one.
Great, thanks, Sophie. Amanda, Watermark has a searchable database. Will searchability of other international certification pathways be a factor for determining acceptability?
Yeah, really good question. So one of the key elements of the regulations for recognising overseas products is that the product certificate is accessible to the public. So that would be sort of the first step. Can we find those product certificates? And then in terms of the evaluation process itself, when MB is actually determining whether that product complies with the New Zealand Building Code, we also need to have publicly accessible information that's relevant to that, such as, you know, technical information, installation information, anything that, you know, can help the evaluation process. So in terms of searchable databases or anything like that, we're going to need publicly accessible information on those products, how they work, and the product certification scheme itself to be even able to do evaluations. So in short, yes, there needs to be a minimum amount of information required for us to do an evaluation and for New Zealand users to be able to use those products.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Sophie, our final question for today is actually going to come back to monitoring. What happens to a product if its certification or recognition is withdrawn after it has been included in a building consent?
Yeah, really good question, and one we've heard a little bit about. So if a product's certification or the recognition is withdrawn after it's been included in a building consent, then the implications of that depend on the timing and the nature of the withdrawal. So it is a little case by case, but generally, if the product was certified and accepted at the time the consent was issued, and then the building work can proceed as approved. However, if the product is later found to pose a safety or a compliance risk, then BCAs may require a reassessment or remedial action. MB's updated regulations also enable faster revocation of non-compliant products. So it's important to kind of stay informed and consult with the BCA if any certification status changes mid-project.
Great, thanks, Sophie and Amanda. That concludes today's session. To everyone here attending, I'd like to thank you for your attendance. We certainly appreciate your support of this new legislation, and if you have any further questions, please take a note of the email address that's in the chat where you can contact MB directly. Just looking at your feedback, a few of you are still unsure whether you would use this in the future. So really tips for you, as I mentioned, recording of this webinar will be available next week. There is follow-up further information and details on the Building Performance website, and certainly look out for an invite to a follow-up webinar in November in preparation for phase 2 of the rollout. So that's it from us. Amanda, Sophie and Byron, thanks for your presentations today. I wish everyone a very happy Thursday, and we'll see you in November. Thank you.